And that's what climate change is about. It is literally, not figuratively, a clear and present danger.
We are in the beginning of a mass extinction.
The ability of CO2 to do the heavy work of creating a climate catastrophe is almost nil at this point.
The price of oil has been artificially elevated to the point of insanity.
That's not how you power a modern industrial system.
The ultimate goal of this renewable energy, plan is to reach the exact same point that we're at now.
You know who's tried that? Germany. 7 straight days of no wind for Germany. Their factories are shutting down.
They really do act like weather didn't happen prior to 1910.
Today is Friday.
It is indeed Friday, and welcome to a very special edition of Climate Change Roundtable. Today we have with us Dr. Judith Curry, who's going to discuss climate goals versus climate well-being. And in this particular episode, we're going to talk about, is it really good to reduce CO2? All these goals that they've set, are they really good for humanity, or are they going to cause more trouble than they're worth? That's the topic today. Today we have with us Linnea Lucan and Dr. Sterling Burnett, and also Dr. Judith Curry. And before we get into talking about a recent blog post that Dr. Curry made, I want to talk about what NOAA, the National Weather Service, thinks about this. They put up a post or a page that talked about the benefits versus the, what you would call the detractions of CO2. And that page says, are there positive benefits to global warming? Well, we all know that there are some positive benefits. We've seen it in terms of the crop productions. We've seen it in terms of human benefits all over the planet. And according to NOAA, they say, yes, there will probably be some short-term and long-term benefits from global warming. For example, the flip side of increased mortality from heat waves may be decreased. But they're basically saying that, the problems associated with carbon dioxide are far greater than the benefits. And that's been the whole central point of the climate alarmism community, that carbon dioxide is going to, increases in carbon dioxide in our atmosphere is going to cause more trouble. And that's why we have to reduce it. In Dr. Curry's most recent blog post on her website, Climate Etc., or at judithcurry.com, there was a post that talked about, she was looking at the human goals versus the well-being, kind of like what we saw there in NOAA. And this is going to be what we're going to talk about today. The faux urgency of the climate crisis is giving us no time to build a secure energy future. And that seems to be very, very true. If you look at what's happened to the cost of energy over the last couple of years, with the Biden administration trying to reduce carbon dioxide through putting on the brakes for fossil fuel production and usage, it seems that, there are some serious problems associated with reducing. So with that, I want to bring up Dr. Judith Curry, and I'd like you to talk about that post and tell us, what do you think about the benefits versus the problems associated with reducing CO2?
Well, the weakest part of the whole global warming argument is whether or not it's dangerous. And the dangers, like melting ice caps and, slow creep of sea level rise, most people, okay, well, this is really hard for me to relate to the slow creep of whatever. So following Hurricane Katrina, people latched onto the idea that even a small amount of warming can exacerbate extreme weather events. And so this has been the main driver of fear. And even the IPCC doesn't see much, if any, evidence that the extreme weather events are being exacerbated by global warming. And even if they were, it's a tiny amount, and it's impossible to separate out that signal from the very large natural weather and climate variability. So this whole thing, every extreme weather event, is blamed on global warming. Even extreme cold is blamed on global warming. Everything's blamed on the jet stream. First, it was the wavy jet stream. Now we have a very flat jet stream. It's all global warming. Well, no, it isn't. And people have just simply had weather amnesia. They've forgotten that there's been bad weather in the past. And if you look at the US, I mean, far and away the worst weather by any measure was in the 1930s. Okay, and this had nothing to do with human-caused global warming. It was natural variability, a series of several El Nino events, and who knows what else was going on back then. I mean, La Nina events back in the 1930s. So, the dangers, it's hard to really identify them unambiguously. The mortality from cold events versus warm events is very well known. There's hundreds of studies, any location, it ranges from a factor of 2 to more than an order of magnitude more mortalities from cold events than from extreme warm events. So that's one very big benefit. So it's a tough one to call. We've seen global greening over the last several decades, mostly due to CO2, but some of it's associated with warmer temperatures and more rainfall, and that's generally a good thing. Global warming is going to bring us overall more rainfall, not in every region, but that's overall good, especially in the Asian area that relies so heavily on the monsoon. All the models and the IPCC projects there should be more rainfall in the monsoon region, assuming that they can figure out a way to manage it. The floods, I mean, they desperately need the water. They have, like half the world's population is in that region and they're water starved. So, it's hard to make an argument. That's the weakest part of the argument, in my opinion, is that this is dangerous or that this is bad. That said, are there some downsides to fossil fuels? Yes. Is it a good idea to endlessly dump CO2 in the atmosphere? Probably not. We just don't know. So, trying to move in a direction where we have cleaner, more emission-free fuels isn't a bad idea, but this should be contemplated in context of a 21st century energy systems that's bigger and better and cheaper and cleaner than what we have now. This is just part of what we should be thinking about in terms of progress in the 21st century. But this mad rush, these targets, these deadlines, we only have time to use existing technologies, put up a wind farm or a solar farm or whatever. This is adding great instability into the power grids. It's having some adverse impacts on ecosystems, and there's a lot of land use conflicts, even in the US, even in places that are rural where you wouldn't think that there'd be these big conflicts. There are. In the Northeast US, where it's quite crowded, I get that you would have some big land use conflicts. But even in, so-called flyover country, there are conflicts. Some farmers don't want the wind turbines on their land. They're worried about the resale property, the resale value of their land. They're never going to be able to sell it to developers, kind of thing. So there's just all sorts of downsides to this rapid deployment of wind and solar. And it invariably raises energy costs and reduces energy reliability. And then people say, and you have to keep, if you have heavy penetration of wind and solar, you have to keep a parallel power system, with gas and coal and whatever to operate when the wind doesn't blow. And then when these aren't used reliably, then when you try to fire them up, then you have some failures, and then they blame oil and gas for these failures. So we've just gotten ourselves into, stupid land over this issue. And if you just forget the targets, forget the deadlines, and try to envision what we want for our 21st century electricity system. And you have to start with, we're going to need a lot more electricity, not just to electrify Africa, not just to accommodate all the electric vehicles and the electric heat pumps and all this, but electricity is the seed and the primary resources for for advanced materials and robotics, this, and artificial intelligence, that, and all sorts of innovations that are currently envisioned and that we're not even thinking about are going to rely on electricity. So trying to do this wind solar thing, it's like putting a tourniquet around our neck in terms of trying to move forward in the 21st century.
Yeah.
And so, yeah.
I do want to make a little quick announcement here, Dr. Curry. And, it just the way things are these days, trying to present useful climate information. And I'm sorry for interrupting you, but I was just informed by Jim Lakely that YouTube is not allowing us to stream today because of a misinformation strike. So we're now on Facebook and Rumble, but we have been censored at YouTube. Isn't it so fitting that they do that? They just can't handle the truth.
Well, I had an interview with a journalist in Africa. This is a month ago. This is at Biz News. And it was actually I mean, she let me talk the whole time. And so it turned out fairly well. And within 5 days, it was up to like 500,000 views, and it's on YouTube. And as soon as it hit that 500,000 view threshold, boom, it was buried. It was buried. You could still, if you search for Biz News TV, you could still find it. But if you searched under my name or anything like that, you couldn't find it. So I think I'm a trigger now at YouTube. I mean, I don't know if this happens to your podcasts regularly, but it seems to be a trigger. I must be on some kind of a list at this point. But God bless Elon Musk. That's all I have to say.
Well, yes. Yeah. I have some 30,000 followers on Twitter, and we would get maybe 2 or 3 retweets a couple of months ago. After he took over, now we're starting to get 20, 30, 40, 50, and many more views. So he's opened it up, and it's sad that the tech industry has decided that climate censorship is the way forward. But let's get back to the original topic, climate goals versus human well-being. Do you have anything further to add related to the post you made on that?
I do. Part 2, I started a series of victims of the faux climate urgency, and I was talking about children. But part 2, and all the bad media that's targeted at children, alarmist stuff. But part 2 was going to be the underdeveloped countries. Now, all of the the aid from the World Bank, from the UN, all of this kind of stuff that was normally targeted at development, eliminating poverty, helping, increase food security and all of that stuff. All that money is being redirected to carbon mitigation. So these countries aren't, getting the funds that would help them to develop. And in Africa, we have this insane situation where they're sitting on a lot of fossil fuel resources. They're trying to get loans from development banks to, fund power plants, but the bankers, their investors are playing this politically correct game where they won't fund these power plants. But in the meantime, Europe is all but raping their resources, and the only way they can get money is just to sell their gas and coal and whatever to Europe. I mean, that is, senseless. They call it green colonialism, energy apartheid, but I call it just evil. And this is all being done in the name of, these senseless carbon emissions targets.
Okay. Dr. Sterling Burnett has a question for you.
Okay.
You're muted,
You're
Sterling.
muted, Sterling.
Sorry about that. I started sneezing, so I muted myself. She actually got to part of my question at the end there when she started talking about developing countries, because it's not just, the U.S. is one small part of the planet, and we have a relatively good energy system compared to most of the world, or to a lot of the world. And it's the developing countries that are really, really being punished by the demand to decarbonize in a very, very short period of time. And so I'm glad that she brought that up. So I'll defer.
Okay, yeah, and the other thing is, because Europe has screwed up their situation so bad, now they're buying up all the global supplies of LNG, liquefied natural gas, and countries like Pakistan can no longer afford to buy it, because they bought into the green stuff and, no coal and whatever. So now Pakistan is screwed, among other countries. So this is just a horrible situation. And then now you see this huge rebound with people buying, countries buying extremely dirty coal from South America, and opening, Germany and England are now mining for coal. And their coal, isn't necessarily the cleanest. If they, but by trying to keep their own country emission free, and then by importing goods from China and gas from Russia, I mean, they've just screwed, not to mention they've screwed their own economies, but it has a trickle-down effect on all the other countries who would normally get resources like liquefied natural gas from Australia or something. So it's just screwed up everything worldwide.
I agree. So I'm going to go to some of the questions that we want to pose to you. I'm going to start with Linnea. Linnea, remember to unmute yourself. And you had a question about the perspective from within academia. So go ahead.
Right. So this is a little bit of a swerve from the main topic that we were just discussing here. But so with your position in academia, what do you think is the kind of driving ethos behind this clampdown on nuance in this discussion? Because I graduated a couple of years ago from college, and when I was in university, if you even suggested that there might be a more complicated mechanism than CO2 making the weather worse, it was met with some pretty emotional and intense backlash from professors toward, a student like me who would ask a little bit of a pointed question. There was a ton of emotional intensity behind it. So I'm just curious, from your perspective and working in that environment, what do you think is driving that kind of a reaction and the refusal to debate it even?
Okay. All right. You need a little bit of history here. You have to go back to the beginning of the IPCC, and this was in the late 80s, and this was driven by the UN Environmental Program. There was a big push to the UN Environmental Program was looking for an issue. They didn't like capitalism. They didn't like fossil fuel. They were looking for, more world government and stuff like that. And so they latched onto the climate change issue. And the IPC started in, around 1990 or so. And by 1990, and it was a good report, and they say, well, we're not really seeing any evidence of this yet. But by 1992, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change had a big treaty to prevent dangerous anthropogenic climate change. Okay, so you had the policy cart way out in front of the scientific horse on this one right from the beginning. And after the first IPCC report, the grand poobahs at the IPCC said, we need to strive for consensus. So this began the whole manufacturing of a consensus, and it was clear the way the problem had been framed by the UN, that if the IPCC wanted to stay in business, they needed to find dangerous human-caused climate change. So this became the focus, and then the scientists really all signed up for this, at least the ones who were active in the public debate, active in the IPCC. Lots of rank and file, and I don't say that, I say that in a complimentary way, scientists like just doing their work and, as best they can and trying to be as objective as they can and stay out of the public debate. There's still a lot of those around. So there is, a background at many universities and in many university programs, but you're right, there's a dominant ethos that you have to hew to this consensus. And why did the scientists buy it? Because it was their naive understanding of how the policy process works. They were trying to speak consensus to power. Okay, this got them, lots of government funding. This got them seats at important big policy tables, and they got professional recognition and became heads of big institutes. So there were a lot of positive feedbacks, if you will. This is the real positive feedback loop in climate science. It's a sociological one. And so the rewards were all there. And then you start educating the next generation, and they've never seen anything else. I mean, there's a few good university programs in atmospheric science where they teach real geophysical fluid dynamics and, the real hardcore stuff, that I learned, back in the 70s and 80s. There's still some universities doing that, but there's all these other environmental climate studies programs that are just, working to educate activists. They're not learning anything about real climate science.
I'll never forget when I took a mineral resources course, and the last unit of our course was environmental justice.
Okay.
And
What university? What university?
The University of Wyoming.
University of Wyoming. Okay, that's interesting. Okay, go on. I'm sorry.
Oh no, I was just throwing that out there, that it surprised me, because I was thinking, I went into these courses wanting to learn about geochemical cycles and mineralogy, and here we are. We definitely got that, but we also were getting a good dose of, to me, out of place politics and stuff in our discussion as well, and that was very strange to me, but at that point in college, not all that surprising because I'd kind of been through the ringer by then anyway. So,
oh my gosh. Well, yeah, go on.
Okay. So we have some questions also from Sterling Burnett that you had submitted ahead of time. Sterling, you want to go ahead and ask those?
Yeah, well, part of it is I've been using your website, Climate Etc., for a long time now. A great source of material. But I've been wondering, so how did the treatment by your peers and colleagues, both at your own university, but also sort of the wider academia as you went out publishing, how did it shape what you wrote or what you allowed to be posted by others on your website, both pre-retirement and post-retirement? Has that changed? And to what extent did sort of your treatment drive your retirement?
Okay. First off, I started my blog in 2010. I'm going to say it was about 10 months following the Climate Gate, if you recall, and that put me out there. I was standing up for scientific integrity, basically. What I was saying is you need to make all of your data and materials transparent and publicly available. We need to pay more attention to uncertainty. how we investigate it and how we communicate it. And finally, we need to be respectful towards the more serious skeptics who are criticizing our work, and we need to take it seriously, and we need to refute it or learn from it, not just dismiss it and then attack the people. You recall this was Michael, the attacks on McIntyre and McKittrick, people who published some papers critical of Michael Mann's hockey stick. This was way back in the day, 2003, 2005. And Michael Mann just attacked them unmercifully, shills for fossil fuels and whatever. I mean, Ross McKittrick's an economics professor at a university in Canada. It just sort of set the tone. And I have to say, the only time, once I made this stand, I was out there, and how shall I say, the grand poobahs of the climate establishment didn't like what I was doing at all. And they were quoted there was a big piece on me in the Scientific American. It was published in maybe sometime in 2010. And the title was Climate Heretic Judith Curry Turns on Her Colleagues. The big story was not that I was a denier or anything like that. It was about that I was criticizing the IPCC, and I was telling the scientific community that we needed to do better, okay, and that this is a different world, at the science policy interface, we need to behave differently, and we need to focus on some different things. That was my message, but the only thing people cared about was that I had turned on the colleagues. And Steve Schneider was quoted as saying, she's working, I don't know what she's doing. I thought she was a good scientist, but she's working to destroy a consensus that we've worked 20 years to build. And I go, whoa, wait a minute. I mean, if the consensus is this fragile, it can't stand up to transparency and an honest acknowledgement of uncertainties. This is a pretty fragile consensus indeed. Okay, so at this time I had started my blog, and I seeded it with a series on climate science and the uncertainty monster, which was a paper that I was working on. And people kept asking me, write something about the hockey stick, write something about the hockey stick. And I stayed away from it because I didn't want Michael Mann to sue me. You recall that he threatened a lawsuit against the Minnesotans for global warming, that funny
I remember
video,
that well.
So I said, I don't want Michael Mann to sue me. And then there was, over at the Bishop Hill website, he quoted Sir John Beddington, said something about, if you're a scientist of integrity, you need to stand up and speak out if you see something wrong. And I go, oh, come on. Am I really letting myself be bullied, by Michael Mann implicitly because I'm afraid of a lawsuit? I said, So I did a post on hiding the decline on my blog site. And for those of you, you're probably all familiar with this, but with the hockey stick, the paleoclimate data just went sort of like this, and they didn't really get that blade until they spliced on the historical data record.
Yeah, the historical temperature.
No, the historical temperature record. Yeah, the infamous post. This was 2011, actually. And so I said, you can't do this. And Richard Mueller, the physicist at Berkeley, he said, he had a YouTube video saying, you can't do this. And what they, it was sort of indirectly implied, in the IPCC, but, people just reading it would be fooled. I was certainly fooled. And what they did is now referred to as image fraud. And the journals warn against that. And it's, it's called image fraud, combining data like that in ways that aren't transparent and justified. So, I mean, once I did that, and I was very careful not to really mention Michael Mann by name. I said, what were these guys thinking of? Michael Mann didn't do this on his own. It was a group of people in the IPCC. But that was the beginning of the end. Shortly after that, Michael Mann started tweeting, Judith Curry, climate denier, and stuff like that. And by 2012, I mean, it just permeated. This is a way to deal with the Judith Curry problem. Just call her a denier, throw her in the camp with all those other wacko people that they tried to label as wacko. And a lot of very smart skeptics. And of course, there were some cranks. And I knew it was really official. And I think it was in 2012. The Society, and there's another blog post, you might want to pull it up. The Society for Environmental Journalists was, describing all the climate blogs, and I was listed under the denier blogs, and says climate, etc., is different than the other denier blogs. Judith Curry is a real scientist. She digs deeply into the subject. She looks at both sides and gives both sides a chance to discuss, and she talks about uncertainties. And I thought that was a great description of my blog, but why is that labeled as a denier blog? I mean, that should define a real science blog.
Isn't it just part of tribalism that's going on in this whole thing?
Yeah, I mean, but this is how fast it happened. Like in 1 year, I became a denier, and I put the timing of it after that, hiding the decline. Then all of a sudden I appeared, the skeptical science misinformer by source list. And all of a sudden I showed up on that, and they quoted that they looked for the worst quote they could find from that hiding the decline page. And it was not very bad at all. So, it was all of a sudden I was officially a denier. Okay. And so, I mean, sticks and stones, I didn't really care much. But once I was liberated from the Michael Mann, don't sue me kind of thing, I just went for it. I, was unfettered, even though the grand poobahs of the climate establishment didn't like what I was doing. There were a lot of people in a much broader community, including academics, physicists, social psychologists, philosophers, lawyers, apart from, business people, engineers, etc., who really liked what I was doing and say, we need a different perspective here. We need a real voice. And as a result of ClimateGate, the trust, in establishment climate science was sort of low. So they were, some people were looking for, well, who can we trust here? And I was trying to be honest, open, and fair. So I think I gained the trust of some people. At the same time, I gained, these people, how can we neutralize Judith Curry? So they worked hard. Now, going back to my university position, okay, after ClimateGate, I started writing what I would say more philosophy of science pieces as relate to climate change, reasoning about climate uncertainty, about the role of consensus in science, this kind of thing. And they were published, and some of them were even invited. Most of them were actually invited articles. And, this was real scholarship, but it wasn't really counting in the College of Science at Georgia Tech. The administration that hired me in 2002 at Georgia Tech was just a wonderful group of people, from the dean on up to the president. They all left, and most of them left and went on to bigger and better things. And then they hired a new group who I think were more, who were not as good, but they were, following the fad of climate science. And they didn't like all this stuff about uncertainty that I was talking about. And, the provost made it very clear he didn't like it. Well, too bad. So my time as chair, I had served for 2 terms, 10 years, that's a long time. And they wanted to replace me, and that was fine. I stayed a few more years until they found a replacement chair. But then I said, okay, like I'm pretty talented administrator and a leader, I should have another administrative position at universities. So I applied for a couple within Georgia Tech, and those were nuked. I said, okay, well, there's no reason for me to be in Atlanta. Why don't I really want to be out west. So I started.
Yeah, it's just really sad.
Yeah, I know.
I
started looking out west. Now this is where it really gets sad. I'm always getting stuff from, headhunters. There's so-and-so position. Are you interested? If not, would you like? I said, well, yeah, I'm actually looking. So the headhunters, they identified some positions for me, and I filled out applications and really good essays about, the opportunities that I saw for this institute or that one. These were some high-level positions. Okay, and I got some interviews, and these are at big places, and the headhunters thought I was a fantastic candidate. And when I didn't get offered any jobs, the feedback I got was that if you Google Judith Curry, what shows up is science denier Judith Curry, skeptical science misinformer list, and on it goes. It was really ugly. It's not so bad right now, but it was really ugly, say circa 2013. When you Google mine, there's no way anybody could make a case to hire me in academia with a Google, when the front page of a Google search of Judith Curry looked like that. So it was over. Okay. So I could stay at Georgia Tech and suck up my big salary, okay, and do nothing. Or, I had tenure. It would take a while for them to get rid of me if they wanted to. It's not so bad anymore. In the old days, it was bad. So I said, okay, I'm done. Academia. Oh, and the other thing why I did, I thought I was conflicted. I had a postdoc. I'll give you a couple examples. I had a postdoc for a number of years, and he was very good. And he was publishing climate-related papers, and he was certainly capable of independent research. I would help him with the writing and make some suggestions and whatever. And he always wanted me to be co-author on his papers. He thought it helped them get some attention and get published. And of course, I would support him. But then he was publishing stuff. It was certainly publishable, but as soon as I publish a paper, there's a big media furor, and I had to defend it. And I said, well, I don't really want to defend his papers. They're not really my papers. They're fine and they're defensible, but I don't really want to go there. And so I realized that I was becoming like a counterweight to anybody who was working with me. It was a disadvantage in the field. He got a faculty position at a good university a few years later. But then I was thinking, how do I advise students? What do I advise my students to do and to behave? This is so crazy. What do I even tell the students? Because what they should be doing as an honest scientist is at odds at what they need to do to succeed, in this environment. I said, okay, I'm done. I'm out of here. I don't need that salary. I can go off and try to make it in the private sector, which is where I'm just having a ball right now. And it's the best thing I've ever done. So I'm in a great place right now, even though I'm shadow banned in various places. I'm doing a lot of really interesting things and important things, and helping people figure out ways to understand and manage their weather and climate risk. And that's what I want to do right now.
You probably.
Excellent. Before we go on to our next question from Sterling, I want to bring up what I think was the epitome of climate ugliness that happened to you. In 2017, you were in a congressional hearing with Dr. Michael Mann and some other people. And this one short little clip really encapsulates the furor and the hatred that went on just because you started asking questions. Let's see it.
statements that have been attributed to me that are not correct. I don't believe I called anybody here a denier, and yet that's been stated over and over again. So I've been misrepresented quite a bit today by several people.
It's in your written testimony. Go read it again.
Boom.
He called me a denier and a fossil fuel shill in his written testimony. Yeah. Okay, and then he gets up there and says, I'm this virtuous person. Why are you accusing me of calling
I never said that. I'm being misrepresented. Yeah.
The disconnect is just unbelievable.
He wasted his whole, that testimony was just trolling. There was no substance to what he had to say. He tooted his own horn about how important he was. Okay, and then he goes on to criticize me. That was his conclusion. That's his message to Congress. Come on.
Yeah. Go ahead, Sterling. You had a question to follow up with.
Well, I was going to say first, listening to your sort of travails there, it brings to mind that you probably learned a lot more about the politics of academia than you'd ever wanted to when you started your research. So in your paper, the one that we started discussing, you talk about the shifting goals of keeping it below, keeping it to 2 to 3 to 1.5, and the dangers of the rapid transition from fossil fuels, without new better technologies to provide electricity. What are your sort of estimations of the dangers of a rapid transition versus the benefits of such a transition versus sort of the cost or drawbacks of such a transition?
Okay. Everybody thinks we need wind and solar. Okay, I'm all in favor of the new Generation 4 nuclear power plants. They sound wonderful. Keep the existing nuclear power plants running as long as as they can be safely operated. Advanced geothermal looks very interesting, and it could be a game changer in the U.S. West, where there's plenty of geothermal resources. So there's lots of, ideas out there, and there's all sorts of these clever engineering ideas for storing energy. This whole wind, solar, battery storage thing isn't going to work. It's very resource intensive. In terms of, the huge amount of cement, steel, glass, copper, not to mention rare earth minerals. It's huge. And these things have a lifetime of advertised lifetime of 25 years, but some people are saying they need to be replaced after 15 years. This is just a huge, do these things last long enough to provide enough power to pay back their power debt from actually building these things? I'm not even sure. So it's just, the wind and solar is a niche solution for some locations and a small amount, sure, but it's not the big answer. Trying to go 100% or even greater than 50% is really a dodgy thing to do with wind and solar, unless you have good pumped hydro storage. That's the only way you can sort of make wind and solar work, with good pumped hydro storage. And there's not that many locations where you can do that effectively.
Right. Plus that, the environmentalists are generally out to prevent such things where you might, create a reservoir for pump storage. They don't want that. So I want to go now to a different topic, but it's really kind of the central point for the whole climate debate. And that's something called climate sensitivity. Now, for those of you who don't know what climate sensitivity is, I got a little graphic here to kind of help you understand what it's about. Climate sensitivity is the response in the atmosphere, temperature-wise, to a doubling of CO2 in the atmosphere. It was first hypothesized back in the 70s. It was called the Charney sensitivity. And basically it boils down to, you take carbon dioxide and put it into the atmosphere, and then you add feedbacks from rain and other types of precipitation to increase the amount of water vapor in the atmosphere. And that then gives you your climate sensitivity, your increase in temperature for a doubling of CO2. The problem is that they have not nailed this down, this figure. has been around since the 70s, and they have still, in science, have not nailed it down. In this next graph, here's a history of climate sensitivity. And this history of climate sensitivity basically shows that, back in 1979, they originally postulated it somewhere between 2 to 3.5 degrees centigrade. Around 2013, they went up to as high as 4.5 centigrade. And then in 2020, we're up to almost 6 degrees centigrade. But here's the rub. Estimates from observations, where you look at the temperature and you look at the amount of carbon dioxide put in the atmosphere, don't match any of that. But models are what seems to be driving climate science these days. And so, Dr. Curry, given that climate sensitivity has never been nailed down to be an exact value, aren't all of these CO2 reduction plans entirely speculative?
Okay, I'm trying to figure out how I can answer this relatively shortly. The first thing is the canonical range has been 1.5 to 4.5 degrees centigrade, and that's sort of been the range for a long time. The CMIC 6, the latest round of climate models were actually, there was one that was 1.8. The Russian model was down at 1.8, but you had a bunch of them that were over 5 degrees centigrade. And so the IPCC 6 assessment report, the one that was recently published, said, look, the climate models can't be used to reliably determine climate sensitivity. And they're absolutely right. And they said, and they used other sources of information, feedback analyses, historical record, and paleoclimate. And they came up with a new range, likely range of 2.5 to 4 degrees centigrade. On the one hand, it's great news that they lopped off the top end, but the bad news is they lost the 1.5 to 2.5, which is probably where real climate sensitivity lives. This was based on a paper. There was a big workshop prior to the 6 assessment report to figure out how we should do climate sensitivity. And so there was a big team paper with the first author, Sherwood, and they combined the feedback analysis, historical temperatures, and paleoclimate. And they basically came up with something like 2.6 to 3.9. Nick Lewis, who is an independent climate scientist and sometimes collaborator of mine, who's just a brilliant statistician, redid the Sherwood et al. Analysis and found a number of errors and also updated the input values to more recent numbers. And he came up with a likely range between 1.75 and 2.7. Okay, with the very likely range, I think 1.5 to 2.9. Okay, so most of the action in Nick Lewis's analysis was below the likely range of the Sherwood study and the IPCC AR6. So what Nick Lewis showed was how sensitive these determinations are to A, the statistical analysis method, and B, to the input values that you use. Okay, so I think using conventional, the conventional methods, Nick Lewis's analysis is the best. But there's still a lot of things wrong with these analyses. First off, the equilibrium climate sensitivity is an ill-posed concept. It's the idea after you double CO2, then the climate has a chance to equilibrate. Well, the climate is never in equilibrium, okay? And it goes, some of the models like the GFDL climate model that have credible internal variability, this just keeps going, oscillating and going. We don't really get any kind of an equilibrium. So it's an ill-posed concept in that sense. And also there's long feedbacks involving ice sheets and deep oceans that, where do you draw the line between like the 1 or 2 century kind of climate sensitivity that we're sort of interested versus long time. There's a whole spectrum of processes, so there's not a clean dividing point. But the thing that worries me most about these, when you're looking at the historical record, we're probably not getting the solar inputs correct. And the IPCC has been using the low variability solar reconstructions for the 20th century, which means that the sun really isn't doing anything. Now, in chapter 2 of the most recent 6th assessment report, they did acknowledge that there's high variability and low variability solar reconstructions, and we really can't pick one because of the so-called gap that occurred following the Challenger disaster. They were supposed to launch a new solar satellite, and that was delayed by some years because of the Challenger disaster. So there's a gap in the solar record, and we don't know how to calibrate the old versus the new one. So depending on how you do that calibration, you come up with the low variability or the high variability scenario. If you use the high variability scenario, and this is something that Nicholas Cafetta has done, you find that the sensitivity is definitely on the low end, like 1.5 to 2 degrees. So this is the big uncertainty. And then the other uncertainty is how natural internal variability, multi-decadal to millennial scale oscillations in the ocean are morphing, into this assessment of the equilibrium climate sensitivity. So, we still don't have it figured out. I think it has to be on the low end, in the 1.5 to maybe 2.2 kind of neighborhood. But, we don't know. And then the other piece of uncertainty is how, in terms of if we were to shut off carbon emissions right now, what would happen to the climate system? Well, there was something called ZECMIP, one of these model intercomparison studies. And they said, well, what would, they shut it off and then they run it out for 50 years. And some models showed, well, it's still warming. Other models showed cooling, but they acknowledged that we don't understand the ocean carbon cycle well enough to know what's going to happen. So, all these feedbacks that we think we understand, we could be missing some big ones in the ocean. So, we don't really know. We don't really know. And
that's that uncertainty monster speaking again.
That's the uncertainty monster for sure.
So, based on all your observations thus far about climate sensitivity, do you think that it's closer to estimates from actual observations of temperature versus CO2, or do you think it's closer to the models?
Oh, the models are useless. Even the IPCC now acknowledges that the models are useless. Oh, for climate sensitivity determination. Yeah. That's in the IPCC 6th assessment report. And this is after, the 4th assessment report went totally with the models. The 5th assessment report said, okay, the models are over here and the observations are over there. They did acknowledge that. And then the 6th assessment report says, with the models, you can tune sensitivity. You can tune these parameterizations to get whatever sensitivity you want. We're not going to use the climate models to determine sensitivity. And that was correct. So, but it's not simple to deduce this from historical observations, because we still don't know what the aerosol concentration was. We still have these uncertainties with the solar forcing, the natural variability. So it's not as simple as it looks to deduce sensitivity from the historical data record.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's this, it seems to me like there's a constant belief system out there in the climate community that the climate is something that's static and processes are linear in Earth's atmosphere over time, as opposed to being wildly chaotic. And they don't seem to be able to get their minds around that, because everything I see seems to be all about being static and being linear. And they don't seem to be able to get off of that. Would you agree with that?
The second monster is the complexity monster. People trying to oversimplify it. No. I mean, the dimensions, I mean, this is why I'm into this whole wicked problem, wicked science thing. We can't even define the dimensions of the problem. And, they keep growing and broadening and, let alone a solution. So that we've vastly oversimplified both the problem and the solution.
I would say that there's actually a third monster, and that's the funding monster, because, so much money is being thrown at this. Entire empires of research are being built around, climate change, and it's very hard for them to give that up. And if you don't continue to push that there's a problem and we have to solve the problem, in the climate realm, then their whole thing disappears. So that the funding monster is kind of, science meets the immovable object kind of a thing, I think.
Okay, but the irony of that is anybody who's received a $1,000 honorarium to go speak at a libertarian think tank conference is in the pay of big oil and is to automatically be dismissed. So that you have all these detectives, Source Watch, trying to find any hint of fossil fuel involvement. Every university, every major university is awash with oil money funding. I mean, you can't get away from it. And to pretend that, we're somehow, it's more pure to be free of energy funding. As these people jet set all over the world, flying in the airplanes and everything with their big computers that, just chew up the electricity, just come on. Okay, but then they don't see the conflict of interest coming from government research funding. Yeah. It's not just what happens in the peer review process. The announcements of opportunity all have implicit, the climate, the human cause climate change and the adverse impacts. That's all implicit in the announcement of opportunities for funding. So, I mean, there's a few programs, pure atmospheric dynamics programs at NSF, where you can maybe get $100K a year funding to explore fundamental stuff, just as long as you don't say anything about climate in the title or the abstract. So it doesn't raise any flags, but compared to the bazillions that are being spent on all these big institutes and whatever, it's just absolutely unbelievable. And they don't see it as a conflict of interest.
No, because they believe their cause is pure. We're saving the planet. Yeah. Sterling, you had a follow-up question.
Yeah. So, gosh, so many things have come up since she started exploring this. But, one of the things that I'd say is the idea is that if the funding is from government, it's pure. Is that government has no biases, and of course, President Eisenhower warned about that. Big government taking over research. But Anthony, you said that they had the static view and a linear view of climate, but that comes, I think, this bled over from ecology, from the science of ecology that used to believe in something called climax communities. Ecosystems reached a peak and then they sort of were stable after that. And of course, that's been debunked for a long time now, but somehow it still lingers on. And it seems to linger on in climate science. I guess my question for Dr. Curry is this. So over time, climate models have seemingly gotten worse, and they certainly haven't narrowed the range of possible outcomes. If over 30 years, the range of possible outcomes has not been narrowed, it seems, if you're an archer, the idea is you may start out pretty bad out of the target, but you slowly get better and you hit the bullseye. So we should all be coming to agreement on a certain point. That doesn't seem to be happening. So if we can't trust the models to predict basic things like climate sensitivity and temperature, which flows from it, why should we trust their predictions on anything else? Because that all flows from their predictions of climate sensitivity.
Well, here's the good news. The one piece of all this where the uncertainty has just been reduced substantially in the last 5 years is the emissions projections for the 21st century. We used to have this RCP 8.5 scenario that was, going, and this is where we got the 4 and 5 degrees centigrade of warming. Okay, and this is what all the impact, this is what the scenarios that the IPCC emphasize, all the publications on these extreme event and ecosystem collapse and who knows, all these crazy impact papers are all driven by the 8.5 scenario. Well, this scenario is now off the table. Okay, the energy economists, regard this as an implausible scenario. Even the last COP, Conference of Parties, have dropped the 8.5 scenarios and now use the 4.5 scenario as sort of their upper limit. So this in itself, cuts the whole warming in half. Forget about sensitivity. This cuts warming in half just by getting rid of that scenario. And it also gets rid of the most alarming impact scenario. But the goofy thing is the people, the IPCC AR6, they told all the climate modelers to focus on the 8.5 scenario in their runs. So all the climate model groups have 8.5 runs. They didn't do the lower ones, which is like 4.5 or 3.4 and stuff like that, where that are more likely. And because of those climate model runs, everybody doing impact assessment is forced to use the 8.5. There was a paper, it was interesting, that those of us, Anthony and I, are in the US West who are suffering under these big atmospheric river events. Okay, we got another one coming over the weekend. Yep. So, I mean, there's this, and we think this is bad. The really bad one was back in the winter of 1861 to 1862 when like 15
the Great Flood
or something like that fell in the Central Valley. Okay, so a group of scientists in California, obviously this is a big deal for them to study. They wanted to know the so-called, and they've created a scenario around that storm. They call it the arc storm. And so they ran the historical scenario through their climate models, and then they amped it up for global warming, and they used the 8.5 scenario and say it could be 50% worse. And then they apologized at the end of the paper, say we understand that 8.5 scenario may be unrealistic, but that's the only one that the climate models ran. So where are we? They always had to amp up the alarm. They could never, bring common sense to the whole thing. So the good news is it's been cut in half. Nothing to do with climate models or better understanding of the sensitivity. We just got rid of that really bad extreme emission scenario.
Yeah, it's amazing how, and Linnea brought this point up earlier, that there seems to be a common vision in the climate community that weather in the past is not relevant. They just discard, well, we had an extreme heat wave in 1936. Oh, well, that's not relevant. Climate's going to make it worse. We flooded the entire Sacramento Valley in 1862 because of an atmospheric river. Well, no. Climate's going to make it worse. There seems to be this idea that we have to, as climate leaders, tamp down any mention of previous historical events in weather and climate as if they are irrelevant. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, weather amnesia. A lot of things you see that they start the analysis in 1979. Well, this is when we have really good satellite data. So let's look at the period where we have good satellite data. Or maybe they go back to 1950 because, that the data's maybe sort of okay back then. But they missed this whole period in the first half of the 20th century where weather was really bad. The worst hurricanes, the worst heat waves, the worst floods, the worst fires. And they totally ignore all that. And that's just in the US. Of course, you have the same kind of thing everywhere else. The worst monsoon droughts, were in the 1800s. And if you use the paleoclimate record, you can invariably find something worse that happened in the last 1,000 years. So, this whole, this started with Hurricane Katrina. And Hurricane Katrina in the US was just such a horrendous event. And it was a career changer for me in many ways, which we don't need to go into now. But for the first time, and with the hurricane and global warming papers that came out at the same time, I was co-author on one of those, the Webster et al. Paper. For the first time, and people weren't caring. Before it was just the hockey stick debate and all that kind of stuff. And 1 degree, 2 degrees, 4 degrees, who even cares? Now, for the first time, Hurricane Katrina, people could say, now I see what difference 1 degree or 2 degrees of warming could make if it's making these hurricanes stronger. And all of a sudden, wow. So hurricanes became a big focusing event for global warming. And the people who communicate, the propagandists, if you will, never let a good disaster go to waste. And then they really latched on to this, the impacts and the extreme weather type thing, and every bad weather event became, was caused by global warming and fossil fuel emissions. And that's sort of what's driving the whole thing at this point, because everything else is just such a slow creep. Sea level rise and all that stuff, that can easily be normalized. But it's the extreme weather events that really frighten people, but they happen all the time. And our grandparents had it much worse, in the first half of the 20th century.
Yeah. What's different now versus what we had some years ago is that we've got constant coverage. We've got 24/7 coverage all over the place. 35 years ago, when I first started doing television meteorology in 1978, I had a fax machine, a teletype machine, and some magnetic symbols to put up on the board. And that was the level of sophistication that we had. Now look behind me, But the point is that we've got this 24/7 coverage now that we didn't have before. And so the appearance that weather is getting worse and therefore it must be driven by climate is actually driven by a reporting bias, where we've got so many more outlets, and we've got millions of people with this fantastic little device right here, a cell phone, that can take videos of weather events and send them over to CNN, and they'll be on the air, literally within minutes of their occurring. And then CNN can comment and say, see, climate change. That's the big problem that we've got. There's this reporting bias.
Well, it's worse than that, because back in the day, even 10 years ago, the New York Times or whatever, they maybe had one environmental journalist, one science journalist or whatever. Now they have whole climate departments, and there are whole media organizations like Climate Brief that are totally focused on climate change. So you've got big money going into media. So it's just, it's a big department.
Well, and
Linnea, you've got something to ask.
Yeah. Well, I was just going to say, I think that we actually do have a little bit of something to look forward to over the next decades. And that is that, we've had relatively reliable satellite data for about 40 years now. And so you have that 30-year climate standardized time period. And every year that we get more data points from the satellite records on temperature, weather events, precipitation, any of that, is another year that it makes it harder and harder to claim that we're rapidly descending into catastrophe. And I think that is becoming harder and harder to refute.
Linnea, that's a very good point, because I think the next 2 decades are going to be decisive. We're looking at some sort of a solar minimum, maybe a century scale one, probably not a monster one. I would expect a shift to the cold phase of the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation. We've also been extremely fortunate for the last 170 years not to have seen much volcanic activity. I mean, we are overdue. I mean, the first half of the 19th century was this incredibly horrible cluster of volcanic eruptions. If we saw something like that in the 20th century, a complete game changer. So there's a lot of things potentially that could happen in the next few decades that would, take this toward the cool side. And that would be, and if the weather even gets worse with the colder weather, then that's really something too. So I think that we're going to get a lot of interesting weather and climate data over the next 2 decades that really could be a game changer in terms of how we think about it. Good point, Linnea.
Yeah, I agree. And, of course, when it gets colder and it stays colder, they will, of course, claim success, right? Because look, we solved climate change.
Or they'll warn of the coming ice age again.
Yeah. So we've got some commenters that have posted some questions up in comments thread, and our producer, Andy, has one right here. Who's got the best data? Is the UAH from Dr. Spencer any good?
Oh, for sure. There's several different groups analyzing that same microwave sounder data, and they all disagree, but I think, and they've all fixed errors that have been pointed out by each other. So I think they're, converging into a sensible place, but absolutely I pay attention to the UAH data, which Roy Spencer posts regularly on his blog. Absolutely, it's good data.
Okay. Yeah, we've been following UAH data for quite some time, and there seems to be about a 10-year pause in temperature in the lower tropospheric temperatures brought in by satellite. So here's our next question. Please tell us your expert opinion regarding the hockey stick in the upcoming Michael Mann trial. I will pre-qualify that before Dr. Curry has to say anything, that she may not be able to answer this question because she may be called as an expert witness. And if that's the case, just simply say yes, and we'll move on to the next question.
Yeah, I can't comment on that topic.
Okay, so let's go on to the next one if we've got another question up. Andy is searching in the background to give us a question that we can put out there. I will say that the Michael Mann trial is coming up at the end of January, and it will be interesting to say the least. Okay, next question. I see that the ocean's role may have been underestimated. The upwelling, downwelling stuff indeed is playing a role with seasonal changes. So what do you think about that?
Well, in terms of what I would call decadal to century timescales, the ocean impacts are definitely underestimated. The climate models have too much power in the 10 to 30-year band and not enough in the 50-year, 80-year, 100-year, 300-year bands. So the climate models definitely don't give us enough ocean circulation variability. The GFDL model is the closest to having a good spectra of ocean circulations. The seasonal, we've had a sort of a wild period with 3 successive La Niñas, and trying to read the tea leaves as to what's going to happen in the coming year with La Nina and El Nino. This is something that my company, Climate Forecast Applications Network, that we wrestle with, and trying to read the tea leaves on that one is indeed challenging. So the ocean circulation patterns are key, and people, a lot of people, climate modelers, these oscillations go up and down, and if you average over them, they cancel out. But the issue is they're not necessarily symmetric owing to their impact on the cloud fields. So the ups and downs are simply not symmetric, owing to the atmospheric circulations that are induced by the ocean circulations and how that translates into cloud patterns.
Okay, we have another question here from Stanley Goldenberg. His question is, RSMAS from the University of Miami had a forum regarding AGW. How do we share the uncertainty without losing the message? Or How do we tell people we really don't know what's happening and yet still keep the same message of alarmism?
Well, hello, Stanley. You have to be honest about the uncertainties. And if you say we don't really know, here's a range of plausible scenarios. Here's the worst case one that we could be looking at. Here's the center of mass of where we think it might be going on. And here's the possible good news. So we have a range of outcomes. Okay, so where does that leave us in terms of policy? Well, I mean, we're going to see bad weather and climate stuff happening anyways, so we should be adapting. If the message they're trying to get across is that we need to urgently reduce emissions, there's just no way. That uncertainty plays into that. If you translate that into, say, look, this clues us in that dumping all this stuff into the atmosphere, just might not be a good idea, even if we don't understand everything. Let's use this as an opportunity to rethink our energy system to set us up for something better in the 21st century to, promote human flourishing and thriving. So I think that's the argument to make. And it doesn't make people want to, let's just go burn some more coal. It says, well, it makes people, this is something that we can maybe take us to a better place, and people can get enthusiastic about it rather than resigning ourselves to the hair shirt austerity, of a wind and solar driven power system that, just isn't going to provide us with enough energy. So that's the way I approach it. And it doesn't turn people off from trying to do something about the problem. It just, the key message is to just get rid of these targets and the urgency. Give us some time to figure out what we can do and to develop new technologies and test them out by trial and error and develop a learning curve. And then we're in a very good position in the second half of the 21st century. So I think that's a message that can be regarded as palatable by people who want climate action. But, by saying this, it's hard to, what I just said, it's hard to then call me a denier, because the only thing I'm denying is that we can urgently do something good in terms of transitioning our electricity system.
Those are sage words, Dr. Curry, and I thank you for them. It's true. Yeah, I think the way to sum it up is just simply don't panic, just plan, because if we get rid of those targets and just plan, it'll be just like the development of our energy infrastructure over the last century. It took a long time to get where we are, but now we're trying to tear it down because we're scared of these targets that are being put out there that don't have any real basis in science yet, because they haven't been able to nail it down. So with that, we're going to wrap up this episode of Climate Change Roundtable. I want to thank everyone for participating, particularly Dr. Judith Curry. And I want to thank all of our... Go ahead.
Yeah, it was fun. Thank you.
Well, I'm glad it was fun. That's how it's supposed to be. This isn't like going before Congress and being called a climate denier. In any event, thank you for participating, and thank all of our commenters for their excellent questions. Remember, we're on every Friday at noon Central Time, assuming YouTube allows us to, and we appreciate your patience with that. We will have this recording posted up on the Heartland Institute website at some point, so be sure to watch for that. And of course, we've got our upcoming ICCC 15 conference in February, and that is February 23rd, and I hope that you will consider attending. Anyway, for Linnea Sterling and Dr. Judith Curry, I'm Anthony Watts, thanking you for participating. Goodbye and stay warm.